Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So let me make sure I am up. I am seeing green all around and everything looks good. So I am going to, yes, I'm going to assume I'm up. So the last one, like I said, it's, dessert before supper. So this is, I guess it's going to be supper. I have one more after this, but this one, I couldn't let this one slide. This is awesome. Utter destruction. Have you ever seen someone go into an interview? The person writes a book, and in writing the book, that person is supposed to be an expert on the thing that that person wrote a book about. Otherwise, why are you writing a book about that particular thing? You know, if you're writing a book about widgets and somebody brings you on to talk about widgets, you need to be able to talk about widgets. It's just, you know, it's, what is it, tautological at that point. Russiagate. So mainstream media has taken this theory, this conspiracy theory, and ran with it for a year. And in none of that time have they shown any connection between Trump and Russia. And yet they've screamed about it for a year. Democrats support this cockamamie theory. And I call it cockamamie because I haven't seen any evidence supporting the theory. They've just been screaming it and asserting it as if their assertions to some degree are true. I have no idea how that works. But ultimately they have no paradigm to explain why Hillary Clinton lost the election. And because they have no paradigm to explain why Hillary Clinton lost the election, after all, their media bubble has told them that she was absolutely inevitable. Trump and Russia. Hey, Trump and Russia makes sense to me. I don't like him. I hate his guts. So yeah, I'm okay with this idea of Trump and Russia. Whether or not you give me any hard evidence or not, my own confirmation bias will make that evidence stick. It'll make it stick. The media has screamed about it for over a year. They want asses in seats. And whether it's showing Donald Trump's empty podium, whether it's going with some kind of scheme to attack Donald Trump in this way, meaning they don't care whether the coverage is positive or negative, as long as it's Donald Trump. It's putting asses in seats. He's a reality show host. He's a reality show host president. And we're going to say that this reality show host president had colluded with Russia. Oh, this real reality TV. Let's make it work. So at no point is the media ever going to go back and repudiate itself of saying, you know what? It's been a year. We couldn't find anything. You guys were right. We went with what the Democrats were saying. We just ran with it. That would never happen. So we still go with this idea of Trump and Russia. The problem with this is they haven't shown anything. Every bit of evidence that they use for this is immensely circumstantial. Now, this guy is coming on, and he's wrote a book called Colluded. And in writing this book called Colluded, he's coming on Real News Network. Real News Network is actually a real news network. These guys are awesome. I love them. Paul J is usually my favorite, but this cat who interviews this guy, he's getting my gold star of the award. I love this interview. This is the way questions should be asked in an interview. Honestly. Particularly when you're dealing with somebody where you're skeptical about what they're saying. This is the way questions should be asked. I love this. He wasn't being unfair to the guy. He just asked the guy straightforward, hard questions. And the guy fell apart. I love this destruction. Let's take a look at this. And look, part of the reason I love this is because I don't like this idea of Democrats trying to get a free pass on why they lost that election. They are trying to use this idea of Russia as being this thing of, we didn't do anything wrong. We don't have to change. It was Trump and Russia. If it wasn't for Trump and Russia and Comey and blacks not being sufficiently loyal and Hispanics not being sufficiently loyal and gays not being sufficiently loyal and Jill Stein voters not voting for me and some Republicans not really voting for me and young people not liking me and the weather being somewhat humid that day. If it wasn't for all of these things, I'd be president of the United States. Now, she failed on her own merits. I don't want this idea of something else to blame, which is what this kind of Russia menace thing is being used for in this case. It thrills me at all. It doesn't thrill me in the least to take this position because I got to be honest. I hated this idea of Donald Trump trying to delegitimize Obama in the exact same way. But this is, yeah, this has nothing to do with Trump in this case, though. This is more to do with these guys are trying to obfuscate for why they failed to this massive degree. And they're trying to use Russia and Trump as a way to do it. This has nothing to do with Trump. This has everything to do with them. Let's take a look at this. This guy wrote a book. I just want to remind you that he wrote a book on this. He wrote a book on this. Defend your position.
It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. 2017 is almost over, but special counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation is not. In fact, the Washington Post reports that Mueller's probe could last another year through much of 2018 at a minimum. The prospect is sure to annoy President Trump, who has been hampered by the Russia story throughout his first year in office. Well, according to a best-selling new book, Trump has ample reason to worry. The book is called Collusion: Secret Meetings, Dirty Money, and How Russia Helped Donald Trump Win. I'm joined now by the book's author, Luke Harding, a veteran journalist for The Guardian and the paper's former Moscow correspondent. Luke, welcome. Let's start with the book's title. Do you think there actually was collusion?
I think we're already across the line in terms of collusion. I think actually you have to go back a long way to see when it began to Donald Trump's first trip to Soviet Moscow in 1987, paid for by the Soviet Union, where he was discussing hotel deals. And I think we can say, and I'm sure this is something that Robert Mueller is looking at, that there's a kind of long-term relationship. That doesn't mean that Donald Trump is an agent or a KGB colonel, merely that there's been a kind of transactional deal going back a very long way indeed.
That because that's also an assertion of the infamous Steele dossier, that there is a transactional relationship between Trump and the Kremlin, and that Putin has been cultivating Trump for several years now. But explain why you think that is, and why you think there's evidence of a transactional relationship.
Well, I think you just have to kind of look at what's happened. We had Donald Trump's trip back in the kind of late Cold War period. And I talked to a whole number of sources for this book, some in Moscow, some in London, some in Washington, some defectors. I met with Chris Steele, the author of the dossier as well. And I think what you have to understand is the fact that the sort of Soviet state and its Russian successor is very keen on kind of cultivating people, particularly Americans. And bringing Trump over for this kind of trip was pretty unusual. It was what's known in the intelligence trade as a kind of classic cultivation operation. And we know from leaked KGB memos that...
Guys, I'm not going to interrupt too much on this one because my interruptions are somewhat unnecessary. I'm going to let, what's his name, just completely dismantle this guy. But I just want to make a point. Did you believe that Trump and Russia colluded? Yes. Okay, why do you believe that? And he's talking about in the 80s. We're literally back in the 80s. It's as if he's trying to make this argument that 30 years ago, they looked at Donald Trump and said, this guy is the stuff of a president, and we're going to groom this guy to be the president of the United States. I'm skeptical. There's just, did Trump collude with Russia? Yes. Okay. I understand you believe that. Why do you believe that? Well, you have to go back to the 80s. You have to go back to the 80s? What are you talking about? Why do you have to go back 30 years? Well, they were cultivating him. You were cultivating him to be president? No, they were just cultivating him. He just so happened to become president. Okay. Let's keep going. Right now, we're still in the 80s. This guy's going to continue to make his point.
The kind of person they were looking for during this period was someone who was vain, narcissistic, interested in money, perhaps unfaithful in their marriage. And basically, Donald Trump kind of ticks every single box. And when I was researching this, I tracked down the daughters of the Soviet ambassador at the time, who went up to Trump Tower, flattered Trump and said, "You've built the most wonderful building in America." And so it goes on. And I think it's gone through phases. Moscow's been interested in Trump, not interested in him. And again, most recently, according to the Steele dossier, became more interested in him from about 2012, 2013 onwards, at a time when Donald Trump was the sort of foremost exponent of birtherism. Obama was in office. And of course, we have the famous trip by Trump to Moscow in 2013 for the Miss Universe beauty pageant.
Okay, but where then is the proof of a transactional relationship?
Well, I mean, there are secret meetings, as the book says, that we now know about, some of which we have discovered about in the last few months. We have Donald Trump Jr., meeting with a Russian lawyer, now famous, Natalia Veselnitskaya, having been promised information from the Russian government as part of its campaign to support Mr. Trump and to hurt Hillary Clinton. We have 4 indictments by Robert Mueller.
Look, let me stop you there. Look, let me stop you there. If we already have a transactional relationship between Trump and Russia going back to the late 80s, as you say, then why would they have needed a music publicist to set up this meeting? I mean, presumably that level of relationship would have entailed some high-level context that wouldn't have needed an intermediary like this kooky music publicist, Rob Goldstone.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you have to understand about Russian espionage is it's not Vladimir Putin sitting in a cave, flicking a red switch, and things happening across the continental United States. It doesn't work like that. It's opportunistic. It's very often pretty low budget. The kind of hacking operation to hack the Democratic Party was done by 2 separate groups of kind of Kremlin hackers, probably not earning kind of huge sums of money. And so some of it is kind of improvisational. The most important thing is that you have people with access, which in this case is Donald Trump and his entourage. And so the oligarch involved is someone called Aris Agalarov, who hosted Trump in 2013. And you're right. I mean, the music publicist is a bit of a curious guy called Goldstone. But nonetheless, it worked. He actually managed to bring the Moscow lawyer to Trump Tower and set up this meeting, which, by the way, the Trump team said nothing about until it finally leaked out early this summer, a year almost after it happened.
Right, but their explanation is that the meeting had nothing to do with the emails that were later released on, by WikiLeaks, that they were about, that the lawyer was promising compromising information about Hillary Clinton's dealings with Russia, and in return she wanted some assistance lifting sanctions, which had nothing to do with the whole WikiLeaks aspect.
Well, I think it's Donald Trump.
So right there, the Russian lawyer thing, this comes up a lot where they say, well, look, I mean, he met with that lawyer. I mean, a Russian lawyer, he has to be guilty. I mean, he was meeting with a Russian, right? Trump and Russia, I mean, there was a lawyer, she's Russian. This was actually interesting because this kind of ended up with a little bit of dirt on Democrats also. The fascinating part about this was the perspective of Russia about what would damage Hillary Clinton or damage the other opponent. It is comically naive. Like, they were giving details of financial records, essentially things going on between Hillary Clinton and Russia. It's like, we have financial dealings with Hillary Clinton taking more money than she was supposed to take, something to that effect. And they were like, this is a nothing burger. It's like, do you know what this country does in regards to campaign finance? Can't get anything on this. Nobody's gonna care about this woman taking too much money. Do you know she's already taking too much money in the primaries? Can't do anything with this. Like, the thing that they were giving them, it wasn't this high impact thing. And this other thing comes up too, is like, why did they have to contact Trump in order to hack the DNC? Why? I mean, well, if Vladimir Putin said he's sitting in his room, he's sitting on a bear, riding bareback on a bear or something, and he says to himself, I don't want Hillary Clinton to win the election, so I'm going to send my hackers to hack the DNC, but first I must contact Donald Trump and I must get Donald Trump's approval. But why would he have to do that? Nobody does that. Like, ultimately you do something that you know is in your best interest. If he was going to do that, there would be no need to contact Donald Trump. This collusion thing is making massive leaps. It's fucking amazing in the leaps that he's making. But let's keep going. And dude is just asking him basic questions. Why do you believe that? He goes into this spill. Okay, I understand that, but that doesn't necessarily get across what you're saying. I don't see the relationship that you're creating. He goes into another spill. Okay, but let me stop you there. That interaction was, and each moment, each thing that the guy is saying, for the most part, he's giving this kind of, this pragmatic explanation, a potential explanation to this kind of hysterical behavior, this hysterical jump into conclusions that the guys are doing. Let's keep going. I love this. I love this. This is like a slow crush, and the guy's getting so frustrated. It's awesome.
Trump Jr. didn't know that when he took the meeting. It's about intentionality. And meanwhile, we have George Papadopoulos, foreign policy aide to Donald Trump, who in the spring of last year is running around my town, where I am, London, meeting a mysterious professor who features in Miller's indictment with contacts to Moscow, who tells Papadopoulos.
Well, hold on a second, Luke. Hold on a second. He tells Papadopoulos that he has contacts to Moscow. We actually have no clue what those contacts are. His name is Joseph Massoud, right? He's a professor in the UK right now, and Papadopoulos claims that Massoud told him that he has high-level Russian government contacts, but so far there's been no even proof of that.
Well, it's in the indictment. I mean, either you kind of live in the empirical world or you don't. But I mean,
no, in the empirical world, in the indictment, Massoud claims that he is, or Papadopoulos says that Massoud claimed he had Russian government ties, but that doesn't mean it's true.
I love that. In the empirical world, because I'm questioning your thing that you yourself, you're living in the empirical world. What he said was a flat fact. Dude said something. You're acting like what the guy's saying is the word of God. He said something. You don't necessarily know that that's true. Ultimately, you've built up one, it's like a web of theories in order to kind of back up this one particular idea, this tapestry. And as you're challenging like one particular, each point in the tapestry, the guy's going all the way back to fucking 1980s. It's like, you're talking about 30 years ago. You're saying they're grooming Donald Trump. They're grooming Donald Trump. Okay, Russia's grooming Donald Trump. Fair enough, 30 years ago. And now you're, what I haven't heard in all this is how Donald Trump was interacting with Russia in any way to hack the DNC in order to release true information to damage Hillary Clinton. That's what I haven't heard in any of this. Let's keep going. I mean, he's going with this idea of collusion and he's naming all of these figures, but ultimately, in one case after the next, the lawyer thing, that was already known. That was already, certainly he understood that what that lawyer was talking about he understood what that lawyer had to do with what the lawyer was talking about. This other case, the Papadopoulos case, again, the same thing. He's trying to make the point where, well, look, the guy said it. I mean, if the guy said it, certainly it has to be true. That's the empirical world. So the empirical world is that people don't lie. That's the empirical world now. Okay, let's keep going.
Well, no, but a lot of very good journalists, both in the US and elsewhere, have obviously tried to get in touch with Mr. Mifsud to kind of try and talk to him, and we haven't had kind of much luck. But I mean, I think you have to kind of understand the context, which is that what happened in the US last year isn't divorced from other kind of Russian influence operations, particularly where I sit in Europe. This is not a new movie; it's a kind of old movie. There's been quite a lot of kind of Russian intelligence activity over the years, including most spectacularly the murder in 2006 of a Russian dissident called Alexander Litvinenko with a radioactive cup of tea. I wrote a book about this case, which came out in the US earlier this year with a kind of huge public inquiry. So there's a sort of volume of evidence, forensic, scientific, intelligence to support this. And I think that this is...
Well, wait, sorry. Support what?
To support the fact that essentially the level of espionage from Russia at the moment is comparable to the Cold War levels, and I think in some ways goes beyond. And what happened is kind of influence operation. Now, we can argue about how effective it was, whether it pushed Donald Trump over the line, whether he was going to win anyway, and so on. But I mean, I think that Russia played a role in last year's election is a matter of fact. I mean, it's certainly what U.S. intelligence agencies believe, and practically everybody recognizes it, apart from Donald Trump, who equivocates on the subject.
He said it is a matter of fact. It is a flat fact. We know this as a flat fact. Nothing that he said up to this point. I mean, he's started off with this idea of Russian collusion, and that's been the argument that he's assiduously made. And in no way has he pushed anything over the line in order to make that case all that clear, despite writing a book about it. And now he's saying Russian collusion in this is a flat fact. I know it for certain. I don't live in an ambiguous world. It is a flat fact. You've always heard me say, I've said, I don't think it took place until I see something that says it did. I don't believe it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't take place. I can't necessarily say as a flat fact that XYZ took place or didn't take place. How would I know? I mean, ultimately, I'm going by what the motives of the people involved in the process, in addition to the data that's been released. And right now, yeah, flat fact my ass. I haven't seen squat to say so. Let's take a look at the response to this. I'm going to love the response. And notice that that flat fact changes as this conversation goes on. Let's keep going.
I have to tell you, just because U.S. intelligence agencies say something, and by the way, it's not even all the intelligence agencies, it's a hand-picked group assembled under the outgoing President Barack Obama by James Clapper. They say something, but, speaking of empirical evidence, they presented no empirical evidence, and they still haven't. So I don't understand why we're supposed to take that on faith.
Well, I mean, you don't take anything on faith. I mean, obviously, you seek to verify and to be evidential and to kind of to follow leads wherever they go. But when writing my book, I mean, I talked to a lot of people, one of whom was Steele, but I talked to other sources as well. And I think people who are sort of skeptical about the whole kind of Russia thesis, and it sounds to me like you are one of those people.
I am. Yes, I am.
Don't kind of quite appreciate the nature of Vladimir Putin's state. I mean, I lived there for 4 years. I was there for between 2007 and 2011. I was eventually kind of kicked out for writing stories about kleptocracy, about Putin's fortune, about human rights, about journalists. I'm not sure if you know, but some of my friends in Moscow who are journalists have been murdered. This is not a.
Notice where we are. Understand where we are. This was a conversation about Russian meddling in the election. Donald Trump colluded with Russia in order to meddle in the election. I'm reminding you of this for a very specific reason. Understand where we are now in the conversation. You sound like a skeptic. Yes, I'm a skeptic of this because what you've telling me up to this point in no way has made your case to prove what you're saying. And it goes from empirical, Mr. Empirical, to, well, I mean, I've lived in Russia for 4 years. I mean, this is not a nice man. Vladimir Putin is not a nice man. He's a bad guy. He's a bad guy. And it's like, wait a minute. What does that have to do with the price of tea in China? What does that have to do with Russian hacking? You're on the show saying that Donald Trump colluded with Vladimir Putin in order to hack the election for Hillary Clinton. That's your thesis. I'm asking you to prove that thesis. I'm being very critical of you because I'm doubtful of your thesis, and these are the reasons that I'm doubtful of your thesis. And to devolve from trying to argue the point to delving into Vladimir Putin being a bad guy because Vladimir Putin is a bad guy. He's a bad guy what? Because he's a bad guy, he hacked the election? Even bringing up the journalist that was killed. What does that have? I mean, that spy that was killed. What does that have to do with the price of tea in China? I don't understand the point here. We're talking about Russian collusion. You started this conversation off telling me about 1980s. Donald Trump being a playboy in the 1980s, being groomed for something by Russia. And now we're in Vladimir Putin being a horrible bad guy. Let's keep going. Let him make his case. I'm just saying this is where we are. The guy being killed. I hate it when they do that because they act like. Oftentimes when media take perspectives like this and they say these things from this moral standpoint of as if we are different. It's like the perspective of media usually takes the standpoint that whatever the United States is doing in the world, it's doing it for the right reasons. So there's no situation where the United States does something bad for the sake of doing something bad. Or there's no situation where the United States, we didn't go into Libya in order to help British and French oil companies get their hands on oil. We did it because we were doing it for humanitarian reasons. There's massive difference in those things, even though the reasons why we did go in had nothing to do with humanitarian reasons. We don't do things in this way for humanitarian reasons. We do things for particular interests. The perspective of media, however, ignores that. That's not on the table. What's on the table is the United States does things for the right reasons, it does things for good reasons. So when it's pointing its finger at somebody else around the globe, taking from the perspective that we do things for the right reasons, it makes it look like somebody else is always the bad guy, that the other person is doing it because they're, psychotic or crazy or weird or strange. When they're talking about North Korea, they don't talk about North Korea from the, and yes, this is a massive jump of the shark, I'm sorry, but I'll finish it quick. They don't talk about North Korea from the standpoint of this particular person as a human being trying to figure out ways to maintain his power in his political space. That's not the context in which they talk about it. This guy's crazy, this guy's firing off weapons, this guy's nuts. You don't get the context that they lost, 20% of their population in the last war. We may not remember the war. Most Americans don't remember the war. They couldn't tell you where it falls in history at all. I guarantee you that the North Koreans remember that war. Seeing as we still have troops on their border and seeing as we still have military exercises, I would guarantee you that the North Koreans still remember that war. Let's keep going. Let's guy makes his point.
Nice or benign regime. It's a regime that...
I'm certainly not arguing that Vladimir Putin is a nice person or that he has great policies. But to me, though, that doesn't automatically mean that he waged a massive influence campaign that got Donald Trump elected. And part of the reason why I'm skeptical of that is that, again, there still is there's zero evidence so far. There's a lot of supposition and innuendo.
I'm a journalist and I'm a storyteller. I'm not a kind of head of the CIA or the NSA. But what I can tell you is that there have been similar operations in France, most recently when President Macron was elected.
Well, actually, Luke, that's not true. That's straight up not true. The French, after that election,
Actually, I pulled this article up because if I'm not mistaken, I did this story when the story came out. Let's see. Okay, I thought I had that article out. Ah, there we are. The latest, French says there's no trace of Russian hacking. You don't say. You don't say.
The French Cyber Intelligence Agency came out and said it could have been virtually anybody.
Yeah, if you let me finish, there've been attacks on the German parliament.
Okay, but wait, Luke, do you concede that the France hack that you just claimed didn't happen?
What, that it didn't happen? Sorry?
Do you concede?
By the way, the German one that he just mentioned, the German one didn't happen either. Germany came out and said that their elections were clean. Let's see. My dog broke my TV, so I'm sorry. It takes a little bit longer to get this straight the way I used to do it. Why no Russian meddling? Why indeed? Why indeed? That's such a weird way to ask that question. Why wasn't there any Russian meddling in the German elections? This is great.
That the Russian hacking of the French election that you just claimed actually is not true.
Well, I mean that it's not true. I mean the French report was inconclusive, but you have to look at this kind of contextually. That we've seen other attacks on European states as well from Russia. That they have very kind of advanced cyber capabilities.
Where else?
Sorry?
Where else?
Well, Estonia. Have you heard of Estonia? It's a state in the Baltics which was crippled by a massive cyber attack in 2008, which certainly all kind of Western European and former Eastern European states think was carried out by Moscow. I mean, I was in Moscow at the time where relations between the two countries were extremely bad. This is a kind of ongoing thing. Now, you might say, quite legitimately, well, the US does the same thing, the UK does the same thing. And I think to a certain extent that is certainly right. I think what was different last year was the attempt to kind of dump this stuff up out into kind of US public space and to try and influence public opinion there. That's unusual. And of course, that's a matter of congressional inquiry and something Mueller is looking at too.
Right. But again, and my problem here is that the examples that are frequently presented to substantiate claims of this massive Russian hacking operation around the world prove out to be false. So France, as I mentioned, you also mentioned Germany. There was a lot of worry about Russian hacking of the German elections, but it turned out, and there's plenty of articles since then that have acknowledged this, that there was no Russian hacking of Germany.
I mean, I'm afraid that there was hacking of the Bundestag, the German parliament, in 2015. I mean, I spent 4 years as a correspondent in Berlin, and I do understand your skepticism, but I think maybe you might just go to Moscow for a couple of weeks, talk to human rights people. There's a fantastic organization there called Memorial. Meet Alexei Navalny, who's the main kind of opposition candidate there, who's an anti-corruption campaigner, whose brother has been jailed for his activities and who's been disqualified by the Kremlin from standing in the election. And
we're back to Putin's a bad guy. Dude, I give you that. It's like, you had me at hello. When you walked on stage, when you sat in that chair, and before you opened your mouth, I said, you know what, I agree with you, Putin's a bad guy. Let's move on. That has nothing to do with anything we were talking about. There's nothing. He's a bad, horrible guy. I get it. He's horrible on civil rights. His policies are pretty horrible. He's a left or right-wing guy. Agreed. Agreed. Absolutely agreed. Let's talk about the Russian hacking thing, or the lack thereof. And at the very least, you have not made your case. You have not made a strong showing. Let's keep going. Hey, he's going to whine about Putin. Whine. I'm going to give you some cheese with that one.
People, ask them about Kremlin hacking. Ask them about. I can talk to Russians on this.
The Russians I've spoken to, and again, I obviously can't speak to everybody. The ones I've spoken to think all this is ridiculous. And again, I'm not arguing that the Russian government is not a repressive right-wing state. It is, but that doesn't mean that it's managed to elect a president. And let me ask you.
What do you think? What do you think Russian spy agencies do? You think they sit around having cups of tea?
I think they do. Luke, come on. I think Russian spy agencies do what all spy agencies do: is they carry out the government's interests abroad. But again, I don't see how you get from that to they pulled off a massive conspiracy to elect a president, based on the fact that back when Donald Trump was hosting The Apprentice, they had the foresight to see a future U.S. president who they were going to get elected.
No, I mean that's a kind of caricatural sort of précis of what's happening.
But it's true. It's according to the Steele dossier, they cultivated Trump when he was hosting The Apprentice.
Well, I mean, that they cultivated Trump, I've got no doubt about. And by the way, I've talked to a lot of people about Steele. I mean, he was a kind of British intelligence guy for 22 years. He spent 3 years in Soviet Moscow between 1990 and 1993, where he saw the kind of collapse of this kind of empire firsthand at the end of communism. He is, you may not like it, but he's actually regarded in London and Washington as being pretty kind of credible. And before the Trump dossier, he produced a series of other reports, including on the war in Ukraine in 2014, using the same sources that he used for his sort of Trump memos, which actually were true and were read by the State Department, even read by John Kerry when he was US Secretary of State. So there is a kind of context to all this.
To be honest with you, Luke, why should we care if people who we haven't met, anonymous officials, say that this ex-British spy, who was hired by Donald Trump's political opponents, first Republicans, then the Clinton campaign, say that he's credible? What matters is the evidence, and whether there's evidence, of, for example, Steele's claim that Donald Trump hired prostitutes, and that Putin has a tape of that. I mean, you I'm sure admit that these are.
Let's be specific, because if you're not specific, it doesn't get across the sheer ridiculousness of what's taking place. The thought was, and I used to say this too, that Donald Trump got peed on. It wasn't that Donald Trump got peed on per se. It's worse than that. Yeah, I think it's worse than that. It was Donald Trump was so angry at Obama, and he hated Obama so much that he hired prostitutes to pee on the bed that the president slept on. Something to that effect. It was something strange and weird. It wasn't just that he hired prostitutes. I needed to get across the level of ridiculousness on top of hiring the prostitutes. Let's keep going. Let's keep going.
Are pretty wild claims, and instead of just believing them based on the fact that some people say is credible, we should have evidence.
Did you read my book, by the way?
Well, listen, I did what I usually do when I do a book.
So you didn't,
No, I skimmed through it, and actually, I have some parts of that I want to quote for you, but go ahead. So listen, yes, to answer your question, I did not read the full book. No, I did not. But I skimmed through it as I do when I do book interviews, because, you know, it's hard to find time to read full books. But go ahead.
I understand that. I mean, sorry, the lights just went out here. But I mean, I think, you know, if you'd read my book, which unfortunately you didn't before you decided to do the interview, you would have seen that there's a whole history of the FSB and its kind of KGB predecessor doing these kind of entrapment operations, going back to the Cold War, enticing American diplomats, British diplomats, and so on with kind of honeypots. The KGB even had a kind of term for the kind of attractive young women they would send to kind of seduce and try and compromise officials. They called them swallows, which is a rather kind of pleasant and poetic title. And really anyone who knows Russia or has bothered to read books on the Cold War sort of realizes this is precisely what they do. Now, did they do it with Donald Trump? We don't know. Steele thinks they did. Donald Trump will know the answer to that question.
Right there. Right there. You've told me all this stuff. This is what Russia does. This is what Russia does. This is what the Soviet Union used to do. Honeypot swallows, Donald Trump. Do we know if they did this to Trump? No, we do not. No, we don't. But that was the point. That was dude's entire point. You guys don't know. That was their point. You're essentially saying, trust us. This guy's credible. This is the stuff that Russia does and everything else. But no, we have no idea whether or not this took place with Donald Trump. That's the honest answer. Let's keep going.
For sure. And so will Vladimir Putin. And I think one of the kind of themes through the kind of last few months, which I think probably you would agree on, is
Putin has a serious man spread going. He is. That's false. Excessive manliness. Let's keep going. I'm sorry.
Is that Donald Trump is incredibly nice about Mr. Putin when he's very rude about a whole host of other leaders, including, for example, Theresa May, the prime minister in my town in England, or the Germans, or Angela Merkel. But we see this repeatedly.
I agree, Luke. He has an affinity for right-wing leaders. He speaks highly of Putin. He speaks highly of. I've never heard him insult Netanyahu. I've never heard him speak critically of Netanyahu. But that doesn't mean that I think that Netanyahu controls Putin. Even though, by the way, there's more proof of collusion, as right now at least, with Netanyahu than Putin, because we know now from the indictment of Flynn that Netanyahu got Trump and his team to try to undermine Obama at the UN when Obama was going to let pass a UN vote critical of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that, but I mean, I think it goes beyond the sort of Trump-Putin relationship, goes beyond a kind of affinity with kind of ultra-nationalist dictators. I mean, you can call it that, but I think there's more to it than that. I think Putin generally does have deep regard for Donald Trump.
And my point is that just because Trump hasn't criticized Putin doesn't mean that he is Putin's puppet. By that logic, he also would be Netanyahu's puppet too. Let me, in terms of the book, okay,
sorry,
go ahead. Please.
It's your fault. That's not my way. But go on.
Okay, well, listen, in terms of the book, I do want to quote you one part that I did read that I found interesting, which is where you are talking about the potential connections between Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign manager, and the Russian government. And so you spoke to a Manafort associate. Hopefully I have his name, hopefully I can pronounce his name properly, Konstantin Kilimnik. And Kilimnik wrote you by email in response to your questions about his relationship with Manafort. And you recount that Kilimnik responded by telling you that the collusion issue was gibberish, and then he signed his email off with by saying, "Off to collect my paycheck at KGB," and then he has an emoji smiley face with 2 parentheses. Okay, and you write, "The thing which gave me pause was Kilimnik's use of smiley faces. True, Russians are big emoticon fans, but I've seen something similar before. In 2013, the Russian diplomat in charge of political influence operations in London was named Sergei Nalobin. Nalobin had close links with Russian intelligence. He was the son of a KGB general. His brother worked for the FSB. Nalobin looked like a career foreign intelligence officer. And you go on to write, on his Twitter feed, Nalobin described himself thus: a brutal agent of the Putin dictatorship, smiley face. So are you inferring there that because two Russians used a smiley face, that's proof that Manafort's associate was a tool of the Russian government?
No, I mean, really what you're doing is now rather a sort of silly exercise. You haven't read the book, but you're taking one small bit and jumping on that.
Because you're using emoticons as proof of a Russian tie, so I'm asking you about it.
If you let me...
Okay, please, yeah.
That is too brutal. That is too brutal. God, that's brutal. You haven't read my book. You're taking this out of context. He's like, wait a minute. Are you using emoticons as one of the planks in your argument that Donald Trump was colluding with Russia? Jesus Christ. Let him explain it. I want his explanation. Let's hear his explanation. Let's be fair. Let's be fair. This is awesome.
Your kind of question, and maybe you could read the rest of the book when you finish the interview. But I mean, this is, Kalimnik is the guy that Paul Manafort last summer emailed about trying to set up a kind of private briefing. This is when Manafort is still Trump's campaign manager for a very famous oligarch called Oleg Deripaska. Now Deripaska more or less sort of sits at the right hand of Putin. He certainly has very close relations with him. And I think it's perfectly kind of legitimate to ask what kind of Kalimnik role was, Kalimnik was playing. I emailed him. We're in kind of correspondence. He's still in contact, by the way, with Paul Manafort. Was emailing him a couple of weeks ago. Manafort I met. I mean, there's a whole chapter about what he was doing in Ukraine, about his work for Viktor Yanukovych, about how Yanukovych became a kind of, kleptocrat. And he's now been indicted with money laundering, with conspiracy against the US by Robert Mueller. So I think it's perfectly legitimate to look at him. And
I'm not saying, Luke, I'm not saying it's not legitimate. I'm taking issue with you writing the thing which gave me pause was Kalimnik's use of smiley faces, as if the use of smiley faces is somehow evidence of a nefarious Russian government tie. And by the way, let me ask you about Manafort. What was Manafort doing in Ukraine? Because as I think you even acknowledge in the book, again, because I did read through it, you even acknowledge in the book that Manafort was not even trying to steer Yanukovych towards a pro-Kremlin policy. I mean, that's widely reported, that he actually was trying to orient Yanukovych towards the West.
Well, it's more complicated than that. I mean, certainly some of the things he did were kind of pro-Western, but at the same time, what Manafort really did was to take someone who was essentially a kind of post-Soviet crook and gangster and refashion him into the image of a kind of modern Western-style politician. And it was quite successful. And when I met Manafort in 2008, he told me that Yanukovych believed in the rule of law, that he'd changed, that he was not a creature of Moscow anymore, and so on. This strategy worked quite effectively. In 2010, Yanukovych became president. And then when he did that, the first thing he did was to jail the main opposition leader, someone called Yulia Tymoshenko, basically kind of suborn parliament, get rid of independent courts, and loot the state to the tune of billions of dollars. And what I actually write in my book is that everything that Manafort told me during this 2008 period was essentially a lie. It was kind of untrue. Now, we now know from Mueller that Manafort made about $75 million, allegedly, from his kind of activities in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and in Moscow. And of course, his next client after Yanukovych, who skipped off to Russia with his billions, was Donald Trump. And one question that I've never been sort of got a satisfactory answer for is how did Manafort end up running Donald Trump's campaign? And you have to look at the kind of constellation of people around Donald Trump, and very many of them, not all of them, but very many of them had a kind of Russian connection, whether it's Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of State, or Michael Flynn, or Carter Page, or George Papadopoulos, who's been done for lying to the FBI, or Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary. Now, I mean, you can be benign and say it's a curious coincidence, but I think it's more than that.
Well, I think Manafort is a longtime Republican operative, and I don't think the answer necessarily is that because he had ties to a Ukrainian president who he was trying to orient towards an anti-Russian policy, essentially, which, by the way, does not make for, does not, I think, add weight to the argument that Manafort was in Putin's pocket if he's trying to get Yanukovych to steer towards the West. But I think we can move on from that point. Let's wrap. Luke, can we agree then that there is no proof of collusion? There even is no proof of hacking. And if I have it right from you, the main reason to question, to think that there is a tie between Trump and Russia is A, the financial connections between people in a circle and Russians possibly, and also the fact that Russia has a history, as we've heard you outline, of cultivating foreigners.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree. I mean, this is your view that there's no collusion and there's no proof of hacking. I mean, this is what you assert.
I said there's no proof of it. Yes.
But I mean, firstly, I don't accept that. I don't think that's the case. But what I was trying to say at the beginning was just to explain that actually what happened last year happens in a kind of wider context of Soviet and Russian espionage. And you know, we haven't really talked very much about Vladimir Putin, about the kind of person he is. I mean, he's a former KGB agent who spent most of his career in an organization that regards the United States as an adversary, not just any old adversary, but what you say in Russian is called the Glavny Protivnik, the main adversary. He thinks about America in kind of zero-sum terms. He thinks that what's good for Russia is bad for America and vice versa. And there's no doubt that he disliked Obama, that he loathed Hillary Clinton, and that he was very, very keen for Donald Trump to win. I mean, you just have to look at Russia. I mean, I speak Russian. Look at Russian state media in the run-up, who were portraying Hillary as a kind of deranged, mad woman warmonger, and Trump as a kind of peaceful, nice guy with whom Russia could do business. There were kind of clear preferences, but also there's this history of espionage, which is still, whether you like it or not, whether you accept it or not, very much ongoing. And I think we'll see again, both in 2018 and in 2020.
Okay, and I guess I'll just say, I think we're conflating the fact that Putin is not a nice person, that he does not like Hillary Clinton. He loathes the U.S. for many reasons, including the expansion of NATO. But I think we're conflating that with evidence and a conclusion that meant that he cultivated Trump and intervened in the election. I think those two things are different.
That's your view, and it would be great if you could go to Moscow,
I love the ending of this. He says, I think we're conflating the idea that Putin is a bad guy with collusion, kind of making this association with one and the other. And he says, well, that's your view, but I think you need to go to Moscow to see how bad of a guy Vladimir Putin is. Fully living out his point. Fully living out his original point. That is a dismantling like nobody's business. And that is an amazing dismantling. Like, dude has a book named Collusion, and in no way could he make that case for collusion. And even at the very end of it, he's essentially broken down into the standpoint of only, he's a bad guy. Vladimir Putin is a bad guy. He's a very bad guy. Because he's a bad guy, you should just kind of, you know, take this thing on by faith. It's amazing. It's amazing. So this is Real News Network. What is this guy's name? Pate. I think his last name is Pate. Paul J is my favorite one, Real News, but he did a damn good job. I love this. Absolutely love this. So we have a crowd. Nice. Let's see. She wanted to use cyber hacking as a pretext for war. She's a mad woman. Catherine Horace, you're probably talking about Hillary Clinton. Derek Neal, I love how you can't stop giggling. I have the same problem when I talk to people like that. It's funny because, you know, he was kind of making the point. He said, you use a smiley face as part of your argument to show Trump in collusion. What other response can you have but to laugh? What other response? I don't think there is another response. It was funny. Aaron Mate, thank you, Luca. Thank you, Luca. That's it. Yeah, that's amazing. I love this interview. Yes, good point. Captain Dumb is dirt. Called it a metaphor. Your argument that we should be a democracy because we elected a black president. 2 + 2 = 7. Let's see. Max's burn bot white supremacists on today's incoherent word salad over there. Classic. I can't believe this guy got a book published. I guess I can believe it, but it's absurd and reflects poorly on the intellectual life of America. Gardno. Yeah, man. You know what I think it is? If you've ever read a conspiracy theory book, like a good, decent conspiracy theory book, where they're like going full into this thing, and it's like Bob ran into Tom, and Tom ran into Bob, and Bob ran into this guy named Jack Spiegel, and he had this other guy named, you know, Sewer Rat, and all of these guys were colluding together and blah, blah, blah. And they weave this intricate story, you know, all these pages long, this intricate details of a story. And you look like, wow, there's a lot of connections here. There's a lot of shit that's going on. Somebody has to be guilty. I mean, look at all these connections. I think it may be something like that. He's weaving this amazing story of Donald Trump back in the 80s, you know, living it up with Vladimir Putin, or living it up in Russia or something, being cultivated all the way back in the 80s, 30 years prior. And it's just kind of outrageous. But yeah, that guy has a book deal. And that guy in no way could back up that book deal. What he fundamentally kept missing is, no, you don't have evidence. Like, you have circumstantial situations in which you're bringing up saying that there are connections between Donald Trump and Russia, and so there has to be something. There's smoke, so there has to be fire. That's your argument. Your argument doesn't rely on this is the smoking gun for this particular thing. What Aaron Mate is asking you is, where's your smoking gun? You're acting as if what you're telling him is the word of God. And he's asking you questions, showing you that what you're saying is not the word of God. They're questions. They're questions. People who question this Russiagate thing are not crazy. They understand that there's a certain amount of self-interest built into the media pushing this narrative, and a certain amount of self-interest built into Democrats pushing this narrative. So you can understand that people should be skeptical about this. God, no, my code name is Sewer Rat. Bob Ramirez said, don't mock my pals, Jamal. I'm not mocking your pals. Don't mock your pals, Bob. Backward country makes backward socialism. To most young, circumstantial speculation, not even evidence. That's all it is. I mean, he's like the intelligence services, and they're like, well, no, the intelligence services were handpicked by, you know, certain people were handpicked by the Obama administration to read XYZ. He has nothing. He is squat. It's like you cross-examine his information and it just falls apart. It's amazing. It's amazing. RBR Network. Jamal, come on, brother. We need evidence that in the mid-'80s, the same Russians of the Bay of Pigs Cuba crisis still wanted to end America's democracy for communism. Really? Fuck out of here. What? The same Russians, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis still wanted America's democracies. Yeah, I don't understand that one. Look, you lost me on that one. I'm sorry. Where's your proof of hacking? Right, that was his question. Where's your proof of hacking? Economics. Gotta run. Susie Dawson live. I read Stevie didn't support his thesis. Yes, he didn't support his thesis. No, he did not. You need to read this entire chat when you're done, Jamal. Uh-oh. Listen, this is a very large chat, Luca. Just read the entire chat. This is a very large chat. Alright, there's one more I want to do, so I'm not going to keep this one. There is a conversation between... Well, it's not between anybody. There's an argument that I want to have. The question with Elizabeth Warren. I didn't bring this up. TYT Politics brought this up. Emma Vigeland. She was making this case for Elizabeth Warren, essentially saying Elizabeth Warren was not a sellout. People need to get off Elizabeth Warren's ass. Elizabeth Warren is not taking money from bad sources, etc., etc., etc. let's have this conversation. This is a lefty conversation. And this is a great conversation. There was one point where Elizabeth Warren was a darling of the left. And you know what? I'm going to have all of this conversation there as opposed to having this conversation in this one video. So, I am... Let me see. I'm just reading through part of the chat. I'm scanning the chat, as if they say. Alexander L. was most likely a nuclear smuggler. Fuckloads of nuclear material went into after the Cold War. Yeah, I heard somebody, yeah, smuggling the information over to the Soviet Union in order to create a balance between the two powers. Yeah. Alright, I'm going to kill this. Guys, I appreciate you guys for showing up. Aaron Mate, good job. Clap of the hands. Awesome dismantling. I love that. He wasn't being a prick to the guy. He wasn't being a dick to the guy. He was just being skeptical. You just cross-examine him. You wrote a book saying that this was true. Show me that this is true. Get it across to me that this is true. And he's just picking the guy apart. The guy gets so frustrated. He gets pissed off. His like arms are flailing about. It's empirical. It's empirical. And at the end of it is like, no, I don't know that took place. I don't know that took place. Yeah, that's awesome. I love it. All right, guys, I'm going to kill this. If you guys enjoy the content, feel free to share, like, subscribe, and of course, you can always support through Patreon. And again, Aaron Mate, good goddamn job. Have a good one, guys.